The air in the conference room was thick with formality. Red velvet curtains framed the windows behind King Charles III as he stood by the grand fireplace in the British ambassador's residence in Washington, D.C. The room held diplomats, reporters, and aides from both sides of the Atlantic. But it was quiet, too quiet for a setting meant to showcase alliance. Then the doors opened with a certain swagger. In walked Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, flanked by his advisors, jacket unbuttoned, chin tilted just enough to suggest he hadn't come to kneel. The crown met the candidate. The king offered a measured nod. DeSantis smirked. They sat across from each other at the long mahogany table. No interpreter was needed. They both spoke English. But they spoke different languages. Charles leaned forward first, ever the statesman. Governor, I understand you've come to discuss education initiatives. Cultural programs. Historical partnerships. DeSantis gave a half-chuckle. I came to discuss relevance, Your Majesty. A few gasps. A pen dropped. Charles didn't blink. Then I presume you're referring to something deeper than budget allocations. DeSantis folded his arms. Let's be honest. Monarchies are relics. Symbolic ornaments. In America, we moved on. Charles's hands rested calmly on the table. Moved on from tradition, or from responsibility? DeSantis smiled wider. From fairy tales. There it was. The line. Sharp and deliberate. The king did not rise to it. You laugh at crowns, Governor, but your electorate still adores pageantry. Your rallies. Your anthems. Your flags. Not so different from ours. But ours elect, DeSantis replied swiftly. Yours inherit. And yet, Charles said evenly, you're seated across from me. The room held its breath. It wasn't an argument, it was a duel. Not of weapons, but of weight. Charles carried centuries. DeSantis carried ambition. Both were dangerous. And as cameras clicked and aides whispered, it became clear this wasn't a simple diplomatic exchange. It was a philosophical standoff. One man represented continuity. The other, disruption. You represent the past, DeSantis said, leaning in. Charles didn't move. Then why does it still unsettle you? The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was provocation. Governor DeSantis leaned back in his chair, the American flag pin on his lapel catching the light. He seemed amused, even entertained. We build nations on ideas, not bloodlines, he said. Our founders fought a war to escape your world. Charles tilted his head, eyes fixed on the governor. And yet, you host me in the capital they built. Strange how the shadows of the past still walk your halls. DeSantis's smile faltered for the briefest second. Charles stood, walking slowly toward a framed painting of Washington and Lafayette on the wall. You claim monarchy is obsolete. But what of the billionaires who buy seats in your Senate? The dynasties built on donations rather than duty? That's capitalism, DeSantis replied, a bit sharper now. No, Charles said calmly, turning back to face him. That's inherited power by another name. The room fell into another silence. The British ambassador shifted uncomfortably. A White House liaison scribbled furiously in the corner. This was not how these meetings were meant to unfold. DeSantis broke the quiet. I didn't come here to get lectured by someone who wears a crown and talks of duty from a golden throne. Charles didn't flinch. Perhaps. But someone must remind you that democracy without memory is just noise in a different accent. DeSantis narrowed his eyes. You think you have something to teach us? Charles stepped forward. Not a threat, an invitation. Not teach. Remind. You may not believe in the past, Governor, but the past still believes in you. DeSantis scoffed, but he was listening now. The king didn't smile. The truth is, you didn't kill monarchy. You just renamed it. And with that, Charles turned and returned to his seat, not as a man out of time, but as one who understood time better than most. The press leaned forward. This meeting wasn't about policy. It had become something else. A reckoning in slow motion. DeSantis straightened his collar, his composure still intact, but something in his voice had shifted. "I don't fear your crown," he said, lowering his tone. "I fear what it represents, control without consent." Charles gave a slow nod. "And yet you govern with executive orders. You ban books before you understand their contents. You redraw lines in education, in history, and call it leadership." The room tensed. DeSantis's jaw tightened. "I act because I was elected to act. By the people." Charles leaned forward slightly, voice calm but unyielding. "And yet power, however earned, still tempts the same arrogance. That of thinking one knows best." The Florida governor exhaled through his nose, half smiling again. "We have the First Amendment. People are free to disagree. But when disagreement is punished with silence," Charles said, "it is no longer freedom. It's fear. Only painted red, white, and blue." That struck deeper than expected. Across the room, a BBC reporter whispered into her mic, "This isn't a meeting, it's a confrontation dressed in courtesy." Charles didn't wait for permission to continue. "I don't sit here defending monarchy out of nostalgia," he said. "I sit here because legacy must still be accountable. And if we are obsolete, then why do men like you fear our words enough to mock them?" DeSantis was quiet for a beat too long. Charles continued, voice low. "Because you don't fear the crown. You fear what it reminds people of, duty over desire. Service over spotlight. Restraint over rage." DeSantis stood now, clearly unsettled. "And what does your crown restrain, your majesty? The truth?" Charles looked at him evenly. "No. The need to shout it." For a moment, neither man spoke. This was no longer about relevance. It was about reflection. And not everyone in that room liked the mirror being held up. The camera crew in the back had been ordered to record silently, unobtrusively. But now their lenses seemed to hover, almost intrusively, as if they too sensed the weight of what was unfolding. The tension wasn't theatrical, it was real, slow-burning, and visible on every face. Charles adjusted his cufflinks, not out of vanity, but as a gesture of patience. "Governor, I am not here to defend crowns or question constitutions. I am here because power must be reminded it is not immune to scrutiny." DeSantis replied, more measured this time. "Scrutiny is welcome, so long as it isn't cloaked in superiority." "And yet," Charles said, "so often it is cloaked in patriotism, as if dissent is a betrayal, and not its finest form." The governor looked to the press gallery behind the king, hoping for a visible ally. None responded. The reporters were frozen in the kind of alert silence that only history commands. Charles rose again, this time walking toward the windows overlooking the Capitol dome. "That building, like Buckingham Palace, stands as a symbol. Yours for democracy. Ours for continuity. But symbols crack when built on forgetfulness." DeSantis remained seated, but his knuckles whitened around his pen. "Tell me," Charles asked without turning, "how many of your monuments honor regret? Or are they all cast in triumph?" "You don't know America," DeSantis muttered. "I don't need to," Charles said, still looking out. "I only need to listen to the silences between your speeches." That stung more than any direct insult. One of the aides near DeSantis leaned in to whisper something, but the governor waved him off. The monarch turned back around. "You said kings are obsolete. But look at your rallies, your slogans, your spectacles. You've only traded scepters for spotlights." The silence wasn't empty. It was alive. The weight of a truth neither side wanted to claim, but couldn't ignore. DeSantis crossed one leg over the other, the leather of his shoe creaking like a warning. "Let me ask you something, Your Majesty," he said, the title now laced with irony. "When your people protested, when they demanded answers about your family's wealth, your past, where were your words then?" Charles's face didn't flinch. "Listening." "That's convenient," DeSantis said. "We get mocked for speaking too loudly. You get praised for saying nothing at all." Charles stepped forward again, the carpet muffling his footfalls like distant thunder. "Silence is not absence. It is often where truth finds shape." He paused. "But since you ask, yes, my country has a past soaked in privilege, in conquest. I do not deny it. But I will not let it be buried under slogans and scapegoats." DeSantis smirked. "Spoken like a man whose throne is built on apologies. Spoken like a man who uses anger to climb ladders," Charles replied coolly. A ripple of murmurs spread through the press corps. Charles turned toward them, not to scold, but to anchor the moment. History is not kind to those who lead by division, whether they wear robes or suits. DeSantis stood, now face to face. "We are not divided because of leaders like me. We are divided because kings like you still haunt the world, pretending tradition means virtue." Charles's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Tradition means memory. And memory, Governor, is what stops us from repeating the worst of ourselves." Silence fell again. Not imposed. Felt. A CNN correspondent whispered into his mic, "Neither man is backing down. This is no longer diplomatic theater. This is ideological war." Behind the glass, storm clouds gathered over Washington. Symbolic? Perhaps. But it felt as if even the sky was bracing for the words still unsaid. DeSantis's eyes narrowed. "You came here to warn me?" Charles held his gaze. "No. I came to remind you, even when the world forgets its kings, it remembers its tyrants." The room froze. The press froze. And for a flicker of a second, so did DeSantis. The silence lingered like a held breath, until DeSantis exhaled, sharp and audible. "You think I'm a tyrant," he said, stepping forward, voice rising just enough. "I was elected. I serve terms, not lifetimes." "And yet," Charles replied, calm as ever, "you speak like a man who believes history should be erased, not understood." DeSantis gestured to the press. "History is weaponized every day. Against people like me. Against the country I love." Charles tilted his head. "No, Governor. History is not a weapon. Legacy is. And you're using it like a blunt instrument, rewriting textbooks, punishing disagreement, cloaking fear in patriotism." A flicker crossed DeSantis's face, something between irritation and uncertainty. "You don't live under the pressures I face." "No," Charles said gently. "I live under different ones. You answer to voters. I answer to time." The remark landed with unexpected force. One of the journalists, unsure whether to breathe or write, scribbled frantically in the margins of his notepad. "This is not a debate. This is a reckoning of empires and ideologies." Charles walked slowly toward the center of the room, away from podiums and symbols. He stood in open space now, uncloaked, almost vulnerable. "You mock crowns," he said. "But your system builds them, too. Every slogan. Every photo op. Every law rushed through for applause. We are not that different, you and I." DeSantis didn't speak. His silence, for once, wasn't defiance, it was calculation. "I'm not your enemy," Charles continued. "But if you keep confusing volume for virtue, you will become your people's." A flashbulb popped in the back. Outside, the rain began, light at first, like whispers tapping the glass. DeSantis turned his back, only for a second, but it was enough. Charles remained still, rooted, regal without force. "I was told you came to discuss environmental partnerships," DeSantis muttered, facing the window. "I did," Charles said. "But the climate is not just changing in your forests. It's changing in your hearts. And no summit can reverse that alone." He paused. "You have power. Use it to plant, not to burn." DeSantis didn't respond. Because he knew. Every camera in that room had already captured what they needed. The sound of the rain against the glass was the only noise as Charles turned slightly toward the press. His eyes didn't seek applause. They sought memory. Not the history written in royal libraries, but the kind passed quietly between generations, of mistakes, of lessons, of dignity held in silence. DeSantis finally faced him again, slower this time. "You speak like a philosopher. But politics isn't poetry." Charles gave a faint smile. "And yet both are judged by the stories they leave behind." The tension shifted. Not dissolved, but reformed, like a storm reorganizing its clouds before lightning. One of DeSantis's aides tried to signal a wrap-up, but neither man moved. "You wear a crown," DeSantis said, "but you don't command armies. You don't draft laws. What do you lead?" Charles answered without hesitation. "Restraint." The room blinked. "Where you push, I pull back. Where you inflame, I absorb. That's not weakness, Governor. That's legacy without arrogance." DeSantis looked at him, not with anger, but confusion. "So you came all this way, for what? A lecture?" Charles took one deliberate step closer. "No. For a reminder. That the loudest voice in the room is not always the one history remembers." Then, he nodded to the press, not dismissively, but with ceremony. "My message is delivered." He turned to leave. But paused. And looked over his shoulder. "The crown doesn't kneel, Governor. Not out of pride. But because it already carries weight." Then he walked out. Every lens followed him. And DeSantis? He didn't speak. Because for once, in the land of liberty, a king had just walked through the room, and it wasn't the title they remembered, but the silence he left behind. The moment Charles stepped into the corridor, the noise returned, hushed chatter, frantic typing, advisors murmuring into earpieces. But inside the press room, where DeSantis still stood, the silence remained, thick as fog. A reporter broke it. "Governor, any closing remarks?" DeSantis adjusted his cuffs, straightened his spine, and forced a smile. "We had a frank exchange. We don't always agree, but we respect the dialogue." He walked off stage, but the statement felt hollow, like a note held too long after the music stops. Down the hall, Charles removed the microphone from his lapel. "He came for a headline," he muttered to his aide. "I came for a warning." "Do you think he heard it, sir?" the aide asked. Charles didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window, the rain now heavier, dripping from the rooftop onto an American flag below. "I think he felt it." Backstage, DeSantis's staff scrambled, managing spin, arranging media hits, polishing quotes. But the governor himself stayed quiet. Not from defeat, but from something rarer, introspection. He poured a glass of water. It trembled slightly in his hand. Across the Atlantic, BBC ran the clip of Charles's final words. On social media, the line spread like wildfire: "The crown doesn't kneel, not out of pride, but because it already carries weight." It wasn't just trending, it was echoing. That night, in the quiet of Clarence House, Charles removed his cufflinks and set them beside an old photograph of his mother. He didn't smile. But his eyes softened. "Not obsolete," he whispered to himself. "Not yet." In Florida, the press briefing began early the next morning. DeSantis stood at the podium, the official seal behind him, flanked by flags. He spoke of state issues, infrastructure, border control, all the usual points. But everyone in the room waited for something else. Finally, a journalist raised their hand. "Governor, about yesterday's meeting with King Charles." DeSantis paused. Just for a second. "He has his views," he said carefully. "And I have mine. But I'll say this, history looks different depending on where you stand." It was non-committal. Safe. Strategic. But it didn't stop the comparisons. Because across the ocean, Charles had already spoken to the press. Not with bullet points. With conviction. "There is a difference between volume and value," he said calmly. "We must not mistake the loudest for the wisest." Clips of his statement played side by side with DeSantis's. The contrast was unavoidable. Online debates flared. Some accused Charles of grandstanding. Others hailed him as the voice of dignity in a political age defined by noise. But one thing was clear, people were listening. To a king they once called ceremonial. In the Times, an op-ed ran with the headline, "The crown still casts a shadow." Charles, however, stayed quiet. He didn't tweet. He didn't issue clarifications. He simply attended a veteran's memorial that evening, laying a wreath with a bowed head and a hand on his chest. No cameras followed him there. But perhaps that was the point. Some leaders chase the light. Others remind the world where the sun once stood. The final ripple came not from a press room, but from a classroom. A university in New York played the Charles-DeSantis exchange for a political science seminar. Young voices debated it with passion, not over monarchy or politics, but over tone, restraint, and what it meant to lead in an era of shouting. One student said, "DeSantis talks like a candidate." Another replied, "Charles talks like history." The debate was alive, but the presence that sparked it wasn't even in the room. Back in London, Charles walked alone through the gardens of St. James's. No fanfare. No press. Just a gentle breeze and leaves whispering in the branches above. His aide approached, quietly. "You know they're saying you upstaged him." Charles didn't respond immediately. He stopped beside an old stone bench and sat, fingers steepled, eyes forward. "I didn't come to win," he said. "I came to remind." "Remind who, sir?" Charles looked toward the horizon. "Everyone." The aide hesitated, then handed over a folder. Inside, letters. Dozens of them. From schoolchildren, veterans, foreign officials. Some critical. Most not. One, handwritten, simply read. "You didn't shout. But I heard every word." Charles folded the paper gently. That evening, headlines across the world continued to churn. Commentators tried to measure political wins and losses. But legacy? Legacy isn't measured in polls. It lingers in silence. In what echoes after the noise ends. Charles had not come to silence DeSantis. He had come to show something quieter. Something heavier. That leadership isn't always about power. Sometimes, it's about presence. And though republics may vote and crowns may tarnish, one truth still stood. You can laugh at a king. But some words, once spoken, weigh more than gold. In a world obsessed with noise, sometimes silence wins. King Charles didn't shout. He didn't clap back. He didn't play to the cameras. He simply stood, with memory, with presence, with the quiet power of legacy. DeSantis laughed. Charles answered. Not for applause, but for history. So now, ask yourself, who truly held the room? This wasn't just a clash of two men. It was a reminder that leadership isn't always loud. Sometimes, it whispers, and the whole world still hears it. Bell, if that moved you, subscribe to Charles Stories. We tell what history forgets, and we don't need a throne to speak truth.